Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Non Tet. At the end of the last daf, we saw a statement by Resh Lakish talking about the value of work, that one has to be a slave to the land in order for the land to produce a lot of produce. And now we have another statement by Resh Lakish, also about working and resting. V'amar Resh Lakish, Nochri she Shabbat, Chayav mita shene'emar, ve'yom v'alayla lo yishbotu. Resh Lakish says that a non-Jew that rests on Shabbat is liable to the death penalty. This is quite a surprising law. We would think Shabbat is a nice thing, and Jews are obligated, but if it's a good thing, so why not? Why can't it be optional for Jews that they can't do it? Well, we have a pasuk here that says, day and night, they will not rest. Literally is talking about day and night, that nature will not cease anymore after the flood. Hashem guarantees there won't be another flood, but rather that nature will take its course, and the seasons will continue, and day and night will continue. But here, midrashically applying this to non-Jews, it means day and night, they cannot rest. Okay, above it was said as a positive that it's important to work the land in order to have a lot of produce. I mean, it is also related to a curse of having to work the land so hard. And so here the idea is that Jews are given the blessing of Shabbat rest, and non-Jews don't deserve it, and therefore cannot benefit from this blessing and are not allowed to rest. Ve'amar mor, azhara shelahen zohi mitatan, amar Ravina afilu sheni beShabbat. And we learned earlier that anything that's prohibited to a non-Jew gets the same punishment, which is the death penalty. The idea there was that most of the laws, B'nai Noach, are logical, common sense, and therefore you don't need a separate warning and a punishment. And so there's no warning. And furthermore, the penalty is the same for all Shev Mitzvot B'nai Noach, and that is a death penalty. So therefore you can't say that, try not to keep Shabbat, and this lashes or a fine. Once something is not allowed, then that's the death penalty. And so this explains they're not allowed, and that's the only punishment available is in fact the death penalty. Ravina adds, not only are non-Jews not allowed to keep Shabbat on Saturday, they also cannot allowed to eat it, not allowed to keep it on any other day, not Sunday, not Monday, and so on. Interestingly, he picks Monday because Sunday, we know by time of the Talmud, Christians take Sunday as their own Sabbath. And so the point is not Sunday, not even Monday, not even for non-religious reasons, certainly if they're doing it for religious reasons. The background of this is likely the fact that Christians came along and they said, Jews are no longer the chosen people. They said, Hashem has forgotten about you and now has chosen the Christians instead. And as a symbol of that, they said, we're changing Shabbat from Saturday to Sunday. So this seems to be a counter to that not only is the Resh Lakish is saying, not only are the Christians wrong, the Jews still are the chosen people, and Saturday is the real day. Not only that, but you know what? A non-Jew who comes to claim and said, we have Shabbat and not you, so they deserve the death penalty. That, I think, may be why this is so harsh. Like, okay, if they want to rest, so why not rest? I think it's so harsh because of Christians' claim of what's called supersessionism, that they claim that they are the true Israel and not the Jews, and use that as a reason to persecute the Jews. And so this Resh Lakish is saying back, no, we have the real Shabbat and you're not deserving of any Shabbat. And now the Gemara says, well, if this is one of the commandments and they chayav mitah, if they keep Shabbat, why not count this among the Shev Mitzvot B'nai Noach? You have to add another one. And also, can't keep Shabbat. Ki kachashib shev al taseh, kum aseh lakachashib. And the answer is the Shev Mitzvot B'nai Noach are counting things of not do, lo ta'aseh. Just sit and don't do this. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, and so on. So these are lo ta'asehs, whereas a kum aseh, go and do something, is not counting. And the obligation to not keep Shabbat is the same as saying, go and do melacha. You have to go to work on Saturday, on Sunday, on Monday. Sunday. You have to go to work every day. So because this is an aseh, it's not counted among the 7. But in fact, if you would count aseh and lo ta'aseh, you're right. This would be another mitzvah that is an obligation upon Bnei Noach. V'hadinin kum asehu v'kachashib. Hold on, is that really true that all Shem Mitzvot Bnei Noach are lo ta'asehs? Go, the obligation to make courts, that's a kum aseh. Get up and make courts. Go make a judicial system. And that's counted in one of the 7. So the answer is kum aseh v'sheb al ta'aseh ninhu. No, in fact, the obligation to make courts is a combination both of get up and do justice, and it's also a lo ta'aseh, do not do injustice. Don't do anything that will lead to injustice. That's part of it. So therefore, since it has an aspect of lo ta'aseh, it's counted among the 7. But really, there's another obligation that is naseh, that says you must do melacha on Shabbat. And this is the reason why nowadays, when people are studying to be converts, they start keeping all the mitzvot, but on Shabbat they'll do one thing over Shabbat to violate Shabbat until their official conversion, and then they will keep Shabbat fully. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Nochri she'osek b'Torah chayav mita shenemar Torah siva lahanu Moshe morasha lanu morasha velo lahem. Rabbi Yochanan says if a non-Jew studies Torah, he is liable to the death penalty. As the Torah says, the Torah was commanded to us, to Bnei Israel, as an inheritance. It's our inheritance and not their inheritance. Here also, it's quite a surprising law. We would think Torah is a good thing. We're obligated to study Torah, but if Torah is good messages, important advice, important philosophies, and all that. So wouldn't it be beneficial for everybody to learn Torah? And I think here also the background may very well be in Christian claims, because they claim that they understand the Torah better, and they give all kinds of interpretations of it. And so they say our interpretations are correct, that prove that their beliefs in Mashiach and so on. And they say, the Jews, you no longer, so the Torah is not yours anymore. Your Torah is Old Testament, as they say. And so this is a counter. If this is what you're going to do with the Torah as a non-Jew, then you know what? You're not allowed to learn Torah, because you're not coming to learn sincerely. If a non-Jew is coming to learn sincerely, that's one thing. We'll get to that in a second. But if they're coming insincerely, coming to attack the Torah, and sometimes Christians, in fact, very often would learn from Jews who converted to Christianity, they would feed them all kinds of things that Christians then used in anti-Semitic attacks. So in fact, there were many times in history where it was in fact dangerous to teach Torah to non-Jews who were looking to use it against the Jewish people. And so for that, in those situations, we would understand why it would be in fact chayav mita. This was not done to learn, but rather to use as an attack. And many of the Rishonim here, in fact, say precisely that's the primary context of this prohibition. Now we ask, now why don't you count this among the Sheva Mitzvot and say also, non-Jews, they can't kill and steal, and they can't learn Torah. That's a lo ta'aseh, so it should be counted. And the answer is Manda Amar Morasha Migzal Kagazil La. Manda Amar Meorasa Dino Kena'ara Meorasa de Biskila. We don't have to count it because it's included already in one or another of the Sheva Mitzvot. If you say Morasha, the Torah is an inheritance, that's the literal reading of this pasuk, well then, since it's our inheritance, anyone else who tries to take it is a thief. And so therefore, non-Jews are already included in the prohibition against stealing. And since the Torah is inheritance to the Jewish people, a non-Jew tries to learn it would be considered a thief, and that's already prohibited. And there is a derasha on this pasuk, right? Some say, Al tikre morasha ela meorasa. Do not read it as an inheritance, but rather as a betrothed. We're thinking of the Torah as betrothed to Bnei Israel. Beautiful metaphor of the close connection and intimate value that we have towards Torah and the love that we have for it. And so if we consider the Torah like a betrothed to Bnei Israel, well then a non-Jew who takes it would be committing adultery. And adultery is also already one of the Sheva Mitzvot Bnei Noach. In fact, Me'orasa, if it's full marriage, then that's a regular case of Sheva Mitzvot Bnei Noach with the appropriate law in the Sheva Mitzvot. And whereas says, although the non-Jews do not have erusin, and so we saw before that if a non-Jew would commit adultery with a na'ara me'orasa, they actually would be judged in a Jewish court and get sikila, which is the standard punishment in a Jewish court. And so this is morasa, they would actually get sikila. So therefore, it's quite a beautiful idea here of treating Torah as if it's an actual thing or actual person. It's value, and if it's considered inheritance, it's like stealing. If it's considered like morasa, it's like committing adultery. So this is special to us. And again, this definitely does reflect an anti-Christian view, where the Christians said, no, it's ours. They took the Torah to their own. They appropriated it for themselves and denied it to the Jewish people. So they said, supersessionism, God has rejected you. This is Old Testament. Now it's ours. We know what it means. You don't know what it means. And they physically attacked Jews for centuries in many places based on this view. So I think this is a reaction to that. It says, no, we have it. This is our text, this is our Torah. And therefore, if anyone tries to take it for themselves, that is not a good thing. However, if someone tries to learn Torah for good purposes, then that actually is good for non-Jews as well, as we're about to see. Me'etibeh, we have a braita that seems to contradict Rabbi Yochanan. It says, היה רבי מאיר אומר, מניין שאפילו נוכרי ועוסק בתורה שהוא כהן גדול, שנאמר אשר יעשה אותם האדם וחי בהם. How do you know that a non-Jew who studies Torah is like a Kohen Gadol? We judge people not based on their lineage, Kohen Gadol, Israel, not Israel, whatever, a non-Jew, but rather their knowledge of Torah is the primary category, and the non-Jew who learns Torah is as good as a Kohen Gadol. How do you know that? Because they're talking about the statutes and ordinances, which if a man does them, ha'adam, anyone, Adam sounds like anyone, then he will live by them, and you have to learn them in order to perform them. Kohanim Levim Yisrael lo ne'emar ela ha'adam. It doesn't say Kohen Levi Yisrael, but rather a human being. Halemadeta she'afilu nochri v'osek b'torah hu kekohen gadol. So therefore we learn that anyone, even a non-Jew who engages his Torah in Torah, that's wonderful. So this seems to be the exact opposite of Yochanan. Not only are non-Jews allowed to, it's very praiseworthy. So how can we reconcile this? And the answer is Hatam b'shav misvot tidhu. When Rabbi Meir said this, he was talking about when non-Jews study the laws of the Sheva Mitzvot. That is good because they have to do those things. And so that shows if they're coming and they want to learn Sheva Mitzvot b'nei Noach, so that means they're coming and they want to learn, and they want to live a proper lifestyle for a non-Jew within the Torah guidelines. So clearly that person is coming with sincerity and wants to learn and practice these laws. So in that case, that's not only allowed, that is absolutely praiseworthy. But if not, if they're coming to use this to attack the Jews, then that does deserve the death penalty. There's also cases of converts. In order to convert, one must learn a significant amount of Torah. You don't have to know the whole Shas, but you have to know sampling of stringent laws and lenient laws and so on. So there also a non-Jew would be learning Torah even before he converts, because they have to know some Torah before they convert. And again, that's permitted and necessary because it's done sincerely. So if it's for things that they have to know and want to practice, then that's good. If they're using it against the Jews, then that's bad. Next, we return to a baraita that we saw a couple of dapim ago that have other opinions about other things that are also prohibited to non-Jews. And we saw there, Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel Omer, Af Hadam min hachai. Rabbi Chanina says, not only is it Eved min hachai prohibited to a non-Jew, taking a whole limb from an animal, but even blood. If you let some blood out of an animal and then drink it, that would be prohibited to a non-Jew. Not only a limb, but also blood. Let's analyze. Tenor Banan. Ach basar benafsho damo lo tochelu ze Eved min hachai. Tana Kama says, only a limb from a non-kosher animal would be prohibited, and we learn that because it says flesh benafsho, while the animal has its life in it. Do not eat. So that means the flesh, right? An actual limb with flesh on it, one cannot have while its life force is in it. So that's Eved min hachai. However, Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel Omer, Aftam Hadam min hachai. Rabbi Chanina agrees with that, but says also blood, even without any flesh, without any bones, just just the blood from a living animal is prohibited. What's his source? From the very same pasuk, he says, just like Tanakama read it as basar ben nafsho, blood from a living animal do not eat. Notice it also has the word damo, so that also applies. Damo, the blood of a living animal, ben nafsho, damo ben nafsho, lo tochel. You have to switch around the words a little, but the word is there, and so that makes sense. So Rabbanan, what are they going to do with this word damo? Who needs it, right? You already says basar, so that's flesh or limb from a living animal, do not eat. So what does the word damo come to teach? And the answer is, it comes to teach that that the law of Ever Menachai only applies to animals, but not creepy crawlies. We're going to see this derivation on the next Amud, that according to Rabbanan, Ever Menachai, that prohibition does not apply to creepy crawlies, because their blood is not considered separate from their life force, from their actual flesh. Kayoseh badabar ata omer, rak chazak libeti achol hadam, ki hadam hu hanafesh vegomer. And we have, now the Braita is continuing, and we have another pasuk that also supports this, the pasuk from Devarim that says, be steadfast in not eating the blood, as the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the flesh. Rak chazak libeti achol hadam. Why does this pasuk include so many details? First it says, okay, don't eat the blood, and it adds also, the blood is the nefesh, is the life force. So we learn separate things from each part of the pasuk. The first half of the pasuk, make sure not to have not to eat the blood. This is talking about ever menachai, because eating. So it's talking about eating, and the blood means while its life force is in it. So don't eat the limb. And then when it says ki hadam, because the blood is the life of it, so that is referring to the prohibition of drinking the blood of it while it is alive. So there you go. You have two parts of the pasuk to teach these two prohibitions according to the Bichanina. Ve'Rabbanan. And so the rabbis who say that blood from a living animal is permitted to non-Jews, so how will they explain this lengthy pasuk? And the answer is Ahuladam hakaza sheneshama yosa bo hu da'ata. So they will say, actually, this is clarifying what the prohibition is for Jews. And without this pasuk, I would think that, I know it says Jews are not allowed to drink blood. I would think that that's talking about blood that emerges from an animal during the time of shechita. You do shechita, a lot of blood comes out. That's the blood that's talking about that you're not allowed to drink. But other blood of bloodletting, an animal is sick, they would do bloodletting. And so I might think that the prohibition against eating blood would not apply to that. Now, it still wouldn't be kosher because there's no shechita done to the animal, but I wouldn't know that there's an extra prohibition from the fact that it's blood. But so therefore, I need the continuation of this pasuk. The first half says, do not eat blood. That I know, okay, fine. I would think that that's blood that comes out of the animal during shechita. And the rest of the pasuk, ki adam hu anafesh, this is coming to add blood that is bloodletting of an animal while it's alive. This is blood that the soul depends on, its life depends on. You don't let out too much blood because you don't want the animal to die. This is done as medication. The idea was that the sickness with the disease would come out with that blood. And so that blood also has a specific prohibition against eating it, besides the prohibition of eating something that's not kosher from an animal that doesn't have shechita. There's an additional prohibition for Jews. So this because it is blood, even though it's blood from bloodletting, not blood from shechita. And anyway, so according to Rabbanan, this whole pasuk is talking about Jews only. For non-Jews, there's no prohibition about blood, dam min hachai. Lama li limichtav libnei Noach ve'lama li limishneh beSinai. Now the Gemara asks, according to Rabbi Chanina, who says that dam min hachai is prohibited also to non-Jews, we're wondering, how come the Torah needs to say this in Bereshit, where it does back here, that's his derasha, and then, that's for Bnei Noach, and then it repeats it at Har Sinai, where this pasuk in Devarim is given at Har Sinai, and applies to Jews. Why repeat it? In other words, since we already have a prohibition for all human beings, that they are not allowed to have blood min hachai, so then, of course, it applies to Jews also. What need is there to repeat it to Jews specifically in the Pasuk in Devarim, which is referring to the Torah giving to the Jewish people at Har Sinai. And the answer is Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina Damar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina Kol Mitzvah Shenemra Libnei Noach V'Nishnet B'Sinai Lazeh V'Lazeh Ne'emra Libnei Noach V'Lo Nishnet B'Sinai LiYisrael Ne'emra V'Lo Libnei Noach. Okay, this is a very important principle, and we're going to analyze it further. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina said that any mitzvah that was said to Bnei Noach, that you find it somewhere in Bereshit and Noach, and it was, or actually anywhere in Bereshit, any mitzvah, as we're going to see, that was given to, let's say, Avraham or Yaakov, anybody before the Sinai law giving, that's called mitzvot beforehand. That's included in Bnei Noach generally. And so any mitzvah that was said to before Har Sinai, and then what was repeated at Har Sinai to the Israelite people, that means that it applies to both Bnei Noach and to the Jewish people. However, Libnei Noach v'lo nishnet b'Sinai, if it was given to Bnei Noach and it was not repeated at Har Sinai, we don't find it later in the law giving after Har Sinai, then that means that it was given to the Jewish people only and not to Bnei Noach. Now this seems a little counterintuitive, because if it was given to Bnei Noach and then not at Sinai, you would think that applies to Bnei Noach only and not to the Jewish people. However, that can't be, as the Gemara will explain, can't be that there's something that's a mitzvah for non-Jews, but not a mitzvah for Jews, that's prohibited to non-Jews, but permitted to Jews. That doesn't make sense. Jews are on a higher spiritual level, and therefore have more commandments and more prohibitions. So therefore, if it's not repeated, that means that original law that did apply to Bnei Noach once upon a time, from now on, after Har Sinai, if it's not repeated, that means it applies only to Jews, right? It shifts. It goes from a mitzvah to Bnei Noach before Sinai, now to being only to Jews after Har Sinai. That's if it's not repeated. If it is repeated, that means it's repeated because it applies to both. And the only example of this actually is Gid HaNasheh. That's mentioned back in Sefer Bereshit regarding Yaakov after he fights with the angel. It says, therefore, Bnei Israel do not eat Gid HaNasheh. It's referring to Bnei Israel back then, and according to the Yehuda, that applied to the children of Yaakov. When it says over there, Bnei Israel, that means the children of Yisrael, the children of Yaakov. So Gid HaNasheh was already prohibited before Har Sinai to the descendants of Yaakov, and then it was not repeated. It's not said at Har Sinai, and therefore, if it's not repeated, that means it transforms from a pre-Matan Torah law to a post-Matan Torah law that's only for the Jewish people. That's the only example. We'll see soon that actually there might be other examples, but that is the one that Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina quotes. Amar Mor. Let's analyze this further. Kol mitzvah shenemra libnei Noach v'nishnet b'Sinai lazeh v'lazeh ne'emra. Any mitzvah that was said to Bnei Noach and then repeated at Sinai, that means it applies both to Bnei Noach and also to the Jewish people. Wait, logically, it would make sense to say the opposite. If it was repeated at Sinai, that means, from now on, it applies only to the Jewish people and not to Bnei Noach. If it applied to everybody, then just say it in Bereshit, and then I know it applies to all human beings, and then that would include the Jewish people. If it repeats it at Har Sinai, does that mean, new update? Before it applied to Bnei Noach, now it applies only to Yisrael. Wouldn't that make more sense? And the answer is no, it can't be. I mean, it may be logical, but look at this example. Mideitni avodah zara b'Sinai v'ashkechan da'anash nochri ilavaha shemamina lazeh v'lazeh ne'emra. It does say avodah zara was repeated at Sinai. It's right there, the second commandment in the 10 Commandments, that's Parashat HaShavua, and so that for sure it's obligated on the Jewish people not to serve Avodah Zarah, and non-Jews are going to be punished for it. It says later on in Devarim and many places that non-Jews who worship Avodah Zarah, they will be kicked out of the land. So if non-Jews are punished for it even after Har Sinai, that means that it continues to be one of the mitzvot Bnei Noach. And so this is an example that was said in Bereshit. We saw the derivations above from Baisav or other derivations, since it was said in Bereshit to Bnei Noach, and it's repeated at Har Sinai. So this is Avodah Zarah, and we know Avodah Zarah applies to the Jewish people and applies to Bnei Noach even after Matan Torah. So therefore we know the principle must be that anything that is said in Bereshit and repeated again after Har Sinai applies to both. The continuation of the Braita teaches that if it was said to Bnei Noach and not repeated at Har Sinai, that means it transforms to a Jewish law only and is not obligatory on Bnei Noach. Now we ask, doesn't it make more sense to say the opposite? That since it was not repeated at Har Sinai, so that means it should remain only Bnei Noach. And you want to say, okay, it's not given to the Jewish people, so then the Jewish people are exempt from that one. Wouldn't that make more sense to say, okay, then it applies only to Bnei Noach and not to the Jewish people? So I see the logic in that, but the Gemara rejects it because general rule, there is nothing that is permitted to a Jew and prohibited to a non-Jew. But Jewish law is more stringent, is a higher spiritual level, and therefore has more prohibitions. And so it can't be that way. Therefore, if we see it only in one place and not the other, that means it was given in Bereshit, but at Har Sinai, we have to transfer that to the Jewish people only, and it's permitted to non-Jews. Now we ask, Velo, hold on, is there really no example of something that is permitted to a Jew and prohibited to a non-Jew? V'harei Yefat To'ar, the law of Yefat To'ar, we discussed this a little above. This means that a Jewish nation who conquers a non-Jewish nation is allowed to take a beautiful woman from the spoils and through a process then go ahead and be with her and marry her. And this does not apply to non-Jews. A non-Jewish nation that conquers another non-Jewish nation, they are prohibited in this in Yeshet Yefat To'ar. So we see here an example of something that's permitted to a Jew but not to a non-Jew. And the answer is Hatam Mishum de la Bnei Kibush Ninhu. No, that's because other nations are not authorized to go conquer other nations. For the nation of Israel, as long as they get the permission of the Sanhedrin and so on, they can go and conquer another nation, and then they can take Eshet Yefat To'ar. But other nations are not authorized by the Torah to conquer other land, and therefore the law of Eshet Yefat To'ar will not come up. Theoretically, if it could come up, maybe they would be allowed, but it can't. There's no context in which it could come up. Hold on, stealing less than a piruta's worth is prohibited for a non-Jew, but permitted for a Jew. Not permitted, but there's no punishment for a Jew if one steals less than a piruta. So that's something, and it's punishable for a non-Jew. If a non-Jew steals that much, punishable, even death penalty, but for a Jew, no penalty. So here's a place where it's more stringent for a non-Jew than for a Jew. And the answer is, Hatam Mishum de la Bnei Mechila Ninhu. No, this is not from the essence of the law, but rather because Jews tend to be forgiving of small amounts. Oh, it's only a paper clip, just less than a penny. So they forgive it, and therefore it's not called stealing because they forgave it. But theoretically, if they did care, then it would be stealing. Whereas non-Jews, they do care about less than a penny. They are not forgiving, and therefore it's a crime for them, but not for Jews. So that's just the reality of the psychology, but it's not from the essence of the law. Now, going again back to the Braita that says, any mitzvah that was said both to Bnei Noach and repeated at Sinai, that means it applies to both Bnei Noach and the Jewish people. Let's ask about that. Look at Brit Milah. That was told to Bnei Noach. Again, Bnei Noach doesn't mean literally from the time of Noach, but from the time of Bereshit, from Avraham. We're calling it Bnei Noach, meaning anything before Sinai that applies to someone before they received the Torah. So a pre-Torah, a pre-Sinai law. So it says regarding Avraham, you should keep my covenant through Brit Milah. And then at Har Sinai, and again, everything after Matan Torah means at Sinai, because even though Moshe taught it to them during the 40 years in the desert, he's repeating to them things that he learned from Har Sinai. And so over there it says, on the 8th day, say, Yimol besad orlato. If you have a boy, he gets a brit milah. So here is something that was said originally and repeated, and according to the principle of the Braita, that means it should apply to Jews and non-Jews, but that's not true. Brit milah applies only to Jews. It doesn't apply to non-Jews, so this seems to be a violation of the principle. And the answer is, Ahu l'mishre Shabbat hu da'ata, bayom ba'afilu b'Shabbat. No, this pasuk, bayom hashemini yimol, is not a repetition at Har Sinai, but actually it's just a clarification. We know the law from Bnei Noach. This actually fits into the category of a law given to Bnei Noach originally, and then not repeated at Har Sinai. And any law like that, right, it means it transforms. It used to be for many peoples, all the children of Abraham, and now it's only for Bnei Israel, only for the Jewish people, because it was not repeated at Har Sinai. The fact that an aspect of it was repeated, that's only to clarify that you can do Brit Milah, you must do Brit Milah on the 8th day, even if it falls out on Shabbat. That's why it says, Ubayom hashemini yimol. It's not here to repeat the basic law. We already know the basic law, but to give this clarification. Once you know the law of Shabbat, and now you're going to say, wait, about what if the 8th day falls out on Shabbat? Oh, yes, you do it on Shabbat. So that's not called a repetition of the law, but rather only a clarification of a detail of the law. Okay, good. Interestingly, the Meisva Piru Revu applies to Jewish men. It does not apply, incidentally, to Jewish women. That's a separate discussion. It also does not apply to non-Jews, even though this was told to Adam, and it was repeated again to Noach. But yet, once the Torah is given at Har Sinai, from now on it applies only to Jews. Okay, so lechem or lahem shuvu lachem le'aho lechem lisel nemra ve'lo libnei Noach. This law was given to Bnei Noach, as it says, go Piru Urvu. That's actually given to Noach, and then it was repeated at Har Sinai. This is in Devarim, where Hashem tells Moshe to go tell the Jewish people, go return to your tents. He told them before Matan Torah, separate from your wives for 3 days. To prepare for Matan Torah, you have to be holy. And then afterwards it says, go back to your tents. Go back to your tents means go back to be with your wives so that you can have children. So from here we learn Piru Urvu, and this is repeated. According to the principle we have in the Braita, if something was said and repeated, it should apply to Bnei Noach and to the Jewish people, but the halacha is not so. The halacha is that Piru Urvu applies to Jewish people and not to Bnei Noach. So this is again a challenge to the principle of the Braita. And the answer is, Hahu lechol davar shebeminyan tzarich minyan achela tirohu da'ata. This pasuk lechem or lahem is not coming to teach Piru Urvu. Really, this fits into the other category of the Braita of a law that was given to Bnei Noach and not repeated at Har Sinai. And any law like that, it did apply to Bnei Noach once upon a time, but then once the Torah is given, now it applies only to the Jewish people. What about this pasuk, lechem or lahem? That's coming to teach a clarification, actually a tangent law. The law is trying to teach us that if a law is given, a gezerah or some law that the rabbis make or that the Torah makes, and for a certain time period, and it's no longer relevant, it doesn't just fall away automatically. Rather, you need another vote by the Sanhedrin in order to permit it. This is a good example of that because originally Moshe told the people 3 days before, separate from your wives for 3 days. So he said a time limit. You have to separate for 3 days because you have to be holy for Matan Torah. So we would think that after Matan Torah, automatically they can go back to their tents. You don't need Moshe to come teach them now that they have to go back, because it just makes sense. It was a temporary law in order to prepare. And yet, Moshe does tell them, everybody, go back to your tents. And Hashem tells Moshe to say that. Why do you have to say that? From here we learn that when there is a law on the books, even if it's a time-bound law for a specific purpose, nevertheless, it has to be explicitly undone, revoted, and given permission to now undo it. That's what we learn from this pasuk. It's coming to teach that principle. It's actually not coming to teach Piru Urvu, and therefore this fits into the category of a law that was given to Bnei Noach and not repeated, and therefore applies only to the Jewish people. Hold on. Once you say this, we see a pattern here in the last two examples where something that is repeated, there's always a detail that's added. I mean, think think of any of the mitzvot that were said in Bereshit as part of Bnei Noach, and that are repeated later on. They're not repeated just word for word. There's always some detail, some elaboration, some clarification that's added. And then we could say about all of these that no, they're not really repeated. They were only given, they were only said to Bnei Noach, and there's not a repetition, but just a clarification. And if so, then all the mitzvot were said, all the Shev mitzvot Bnei Noach would have been said, but not repeated, and then therefore all apply only to Jews, and none would apply to non-Jews. So we have to answer as follows: Hachi kamad azara mi hadad umitna ba lamali. The question is, why do you have to say the prohibition also? Usually the Torah, when it does repeat, it says the prohibition, and then it adds, oh, and also here's some details about the law. And so you wouldn't need the repetition of the prohibition itself. You could just say the details if you just wanted a clarification. And from the fact that in most of these cases, it says a law regarding Bnei Noach, and then later on, it repeats the prohibition and then adds more details. So then it's not just for the details, it's also there to repeat the prohibition. And since it repeats it, that means that it applies to Jews and non-Jews. So if you look through the Shev Mitzvot Bnei Noach, you'll find that they do in fact repeat the prohibition itself and then add new details. So it fits the category of something that's said to Bnei Noach and repeated on Sinai, which applies to both. Now, in the Braita said that the only example we have of something that was said to Bnei Noach and not repeated is Gid HaNasheh, and therefore it applies only to Jews. In the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who said that Gid HaNasheh was given to Yaakov and was applied to Bnei Yaakov, and it wasn't only a verse that applied to the future Jewish people, but applied back then. So then this is an example, and the only example of something that applied before to Bnei Noach and then was not repeated. But hold on, now we have two more examples of things that were said before and not repeated. Right? We just had these two examples, and that would be Brit Milah. We said it wasn't really repeated, that just the detail was repeated, but it was only said back then, and therefore applies only to the Jewish people. And Pirur Vu was not really repeated. This pasuk is talking about something else. So we actually do have other examples, not only Gid HaNasheh. So why didn't you count these examples too? So there's two answers. The first answer is that regarding those other examples, like Brit Milah, that was repeated in order to give a certain detail, that you do Brit Milah even on Shabbat. Whereas Gid HaNasheh is not mentioned at all later on. So that's why it says in the Braita, this is the only example. You're right, there are other examples, but this is the only example where it's given in Bereshit and it's not repeated at all after Har Sinai. The other examples are repeated, even though it's only for the details, and therefore it counts as if it's something that was only given to Bnei Noach and not repeated, and therefore applies only to Bnei Israel. The second answer is Ibayetema Milam Eikara Abraham Hu Deka Mazhar Lerachamana Ve'ata et Beriti Tishmor Ata Vezaracha Charecha Ledorotam Ata Vezaracha In Inishacharina La. You can say that regarding Brit Milah, it was given originally to Avraham in order that he teach his descendants about it. So in other words, even though, yes, it was given before Matan Torah, at the initial giving to Avraham, Hashem told Avraham, you will keep my berit, not only you, but also your descendants after you. Your descendants, meaning the Jewish people, yes, they will do Brit Milah, but not the rest of the world. So therefore, this does not, in fact, count under the category of something that was given to Bnei Noach, like Gid HaNasheh, and not repeated, and therefore applies only to Bnei Israel. This is something that is true. It was given before Har Sinai, but not to Bnei Noach for everyone. It was given to Abraham only for specifically his descendants, and within his descendants specifically the Jewish people. And therefore, this is not the same as Gid HaNasheh. Now, if it's true that Hashem told Abraham, you keep Brit Milah and your descendants, Ishmael is also his descendants, so how come we don't say that they are obligated in Brit Milah? Because the pasuk says, says, through Yitzchak, that offspring shall be called yours, and not Ishmael. So when it says, you v'zaracha, it's not all zaracha, but whoever will be called your official seed, and that is the Yitzchak and not Ishmael. Bnei Esav lechayebu. Okay, within Yitzchak you have Esav also. So how come Bnei Esav are not liable, are not obligated in Brit Milah? And the answer is Be Yitzchak velo kol Yitzchak. Within Yitzchak, not everybody that comes from Yitzchak, only Yaakov, but not Esav. Matkid larav Oshaya elimata bnei keturah la lichayevu. Mesorav Oshaya says, according to that, should bnei keturah not be liable? The idea is that bnei keturah, in fact, are liable, because it says Be Yitzchak, only some of Yitzchak, but not everybody from Yitzchak. So how do you know that bnei keturah are liable if you can exclude them? Oh, we have another derasha that says from the pasuk in Bereshit, and circumcised was not circumcised in the flesh shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Why do you need those extra words? That comes to include bnei keturah, that they are in fact obligated in Brit Milah. So there you go. That's very interesting. It's not only Bnei Israel, but also Bnei Keturah are obligated. Rashi says only the direct sons, but not the generations after. Others say that Bnei Keturah, wherever they are, maybe this was the original Arab nomadic people, and that's the origin who got mixed in then later with the Muslims. And so that may be the reason why Muslims still today do in fact Brit Milah. It might be related to this obligation upon Bnei Keturah. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Adam Rishon lo tar lo basar le'achila, tichtib lachem yeh le'ochla ulchol chayat ha'aretz ve'lo chayat ha'aretz lachem. Rav says that Adam Rishon was not permitted to eat meat. He was a vegetarian, and this is really the peshat of the pasuk, where Hashem said, I've given you all the herbs and everything that's on the earth, every tree and fruit tree, everything that grows from the ground shall be you for food, and also for all the animals of the earth, it will be food, and for the fowl and all that creeps upon the earth, every green herb for food. So in other words, not only were humans vegetarian, but all animals and birds and creepy crawlies, everything was vegetarian originally at the time of Adam. And so we learn, the herbs will be for animals to eat and not the other way around. Animals are not for humans to eat and not for food. So we see that Adam was originally vegetarian. However, after Noach, after the flood, now Hashem says, well, you know what? We have to make a concession because mankind has violence in him, and if it goes unchecked, then they'll just be violent towards other human beings and kill humans and so on. And so therefore, Hashem said, all right, let's try something else. We'll make a compromise. And so from now on, animals will be to you like herbs. Just like before you could eat things that grow, now you're allowed to eat animals as well. And so this is a new law from now on. Adam was vegetarian. From now on, Noach and his descendants are allowed to eat meat. Now you'd think, once he's allowed to eat meat, maybe that means he can even rip off a limb of an animal and eat it while the animal is alive. So therefore the pasuk says, however, ach is exclusionary. You can eat animals, but not flesh, while the life force is in it. So while the animal is alive, you cannot eat the flesh. And now you'll wonder, maybe that applies to creepy crawlies like snakes and things. That also would apply, Ever Minachai would also apply to that. You'd have to kill a snake before you eat it. No, it says ach, that comes to as an exclusionary word, and that comes to teach that the law of the prohibition of Ever Minachai applies only to animals and does not apply to creepy crawlies. Creepy crawlies you can take cut off a section of it and eat it. Bnei Noach are allowed. Umay Talmuda. Now, how do you know that? Where do you see this? This is from the pasuk. Amar Rav Yehuda damo misha damo chaluk mibesaro yasu shirashim shen damam chaluk mibesaram. Because this pasuk here says damo, so that means that, and that's the source of Ever Minachai. That means Ever Minachai applies only to a species whose blood is separate from its flesh. Separate from its flesh has to do something with its having a living soul. It's a higher order animal. Whereas these creepy crawlies, we don't consider their blood to be separate from their flesh. It's all one, and therefore it's not like they don't have a soul, they don't have a high level living force, and therefore every minachai does not apply to them. Now we're challenging this original statement of Rav that he said Adam was vegetarian. How could it be? After all, Pasuk says as a blessing to Adam, you will have dominion over the fish of the sea and fowl of the air, every living thing that creeps upon the land. And so we're assuming that dominion over them. What does it mean to have dominion over them? Doesn't that mean that you're allowed to eat them? My love la'achila? And the answer is no, limlacha. When it says you're going to have dominion over everything else, it means that you can use them for work. Yes, you can use animals. You can use them. Adam was able to use animals for work if he wanted to ride a horse or use an ox to pull something, to carry things. That would be okay, but he cannot eat them. All right, fine. I mean, that makes sense for animals because you work animals. But v'dagim b'nei melachaninu. But fish, can you put a fish to work? What kind of work can a fish do for you? And the answer is in k'derachaba debay rachaba in hig ve'izav v'shibuta mai. In fact, yes, you could make a fish do work for you, as Rechava once asked about the law of kilayim. Law of kilayim says you cannot take two species and have them pull a plow together. Because one will be strong, one will be weak. If you take a donkey and an ox, for example. But he asked, what about if you take a goat and a shibuta fish? This was a big fish. So imagine if you have some land that's next to a river and you tie a rope onto a shibuta, this big fish, and you attach it to a plow, and you also attach the plow to a goat. And the goat and the fish will pull the plow together. Does that violate kilayim or not? Okay, so from the fact that he asked that question shows that you can think of a scenario where a fish could do some work for you. And so yes, that in fact, when it says that you will rule over the fish, it doesn't mean eat them, it means to have them work. Tashema, ubov hashamayim, my lav lachila. Okay, another challenge. You said Adam was vegetarian. He didn't even eat birds. Then how come it says that you will rule over birds? Doesn't ruling over birds mean that you're allowed to eat them? No, lo limlacha means that you can use birds for work. You can put them to work. Can birds really do work? What kind of productive work can they do? And the answer is in. After all, there's a question by Rabbah, Barav Yehuna. Let's say you take a geese and chickens and they thresh for you, right? They step on the grain and help you with the threshing. What does the law of do not muzzle an ox apply to that? Lo tachsom shor bidisha. We know that according to the Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, he says this applies to animals that walk on four, so like oxen. But what about birds that walk on two? So would it apply to them or not? We're not answering the question. The point is from the fact that he asked the question, it means that you can have get chicken and geese. They can step on grain and help work and help thresh. So yes, you can put them to work, and that's what it means when it says rule over them. Doesn't mean eat them. Now it says you're going to rule over creepy crawlies. Doesn't that mean also to eat them? And that was again a challenge that Adam was vegetarian. And the answer here also is that no, it means to put them to work. And this is referring to, well, most creepy crawlies would be, and not all creepy crawlies can you put to work. Most of them you can't. But this phrase comes to include the snake. And the snake can do work for you, at least the original snake at the time of Adam. And how do we know that? The Tanya. Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya Omer, Havala al shamash gadol she'avad min ha'olam, she'maleh lo nitkalel nahash, kol echad ve'echad misrael hayu mizdamenin lo shene nechashim tovim. Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya says in the Braita, right, woe over the great attendant that has been lost to the world, referring to the snake. If not that there was Adam and Chava sinned because of the snake, and if not that the snake was cursed, and then the snake, after the curse, the snake couldn't do anything anymore. It could just squirm on its belly. But beforehand, when the snake was able to walk and talk, then it was a very good attendant. It was a good butler and a waiter, and it could do anything you wanted. And if not that the snake was cursed, every Jew would have two snakes, two good ones. Echad mishagero l'safon ve'echad mishagero l'darom ve'habi'u lo sandalbonim tobim ve'abanim tovot u'margaliot. Ever have two, and he would send one to the north and one to the south, and they would bring these precious jewels. This is some kind of special stone, this sandalbonim and other precious stones, and bring it, and he'd just get rich easy. ולא אלא שמפשילין רצועה תחת זנבו ומוציא בה עפר לגינתו ולחורבתו. And furthermore, the snake would be able to put a harness, put a strap. You could attach a strap to the snake's tail, and like a harness, and it would be able to take dirt out to his garden and build a ruin, and be able to go and do work and build and take and come and go, just like animals can help someone with their work. So the snake originally would have been under the dominion of man, not to eat, but rather to serve him and do work for him. And now yet another challenge to the statement that Adam was vegetarian. This following Braita says, Haya Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema omer, Adam Rishon meseh began Eden haya. V'yom alachei sharet solin lo basar u'masanenin lo yayin. Adam Rishon would recline in Gan Eden, and the angels themselves would barbecue meat for him and strain wine for him, and he sat and ate meat and wine. So you see that Adam ate meat according to this. The continuation of the story is, the snake saw how he's being treated with such great honor, and the snake was jealous, and that's why the snake set them up to sin. Anyway, this is a problem because it says explicit here that Adam was not vegetarian. He ate meat. And the answer is, Hatam bebasar hayored min hashamayim. This was not meat from an animal. This was meat that fell from heaven, special meat. This was like fake meat, but it was really good. It really tasted like meat. It didn't come from an animal, and so therefore, in fact, he was vegetarian. So he ate, a factory meat. Here, the factory was from heaven, but this was lab-grown meat, not actual meat that came from an animal, but rather came from heaven, so it doesn't count as meat. In fact, Adam never ate anything from an animal. He only ate vegetarian and things that were lab-grown in heaven. And now we ask, is there such a thing of meat that drops down from heaven? And the answer is in, and we have a story about it. There is. Ki had Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta. Havakazil be'urcha. One time Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta was walking on the road. Paga'u bo hanachar yavata davu. And some lions came that were roaring at him. They were hungry. They were going to eat him. So he quoted the pasuk, young lions are roaring for their prey, as a prayer. And miraculously, two thighs of an animal dropped from heaven, and the lions ate one of these, and they were full, and that's it. So they didn't want to eat the rabbi anymore. And the other one, they had leftovers. And so Rabbi Shimon brought it to the Bet Midrash to ask about it. Is this kosher or not kosher? We don't know. Who's the mashgiach? Who is the shochet? Does it have a stamp on it? Right? Is this kosher? He doesn't know. And the rabbis in Bet Midrash says nothing that's not kosher descends from heaven. If it's from heaven, it answers to a higher authority, and therefore it is surely kosher. You can go ahead and eat it. And then Rabbi Zera asked Rabbi Abu, what if a donkey falls from heaven? Well, it's not an actual donkey, it's a lab-grown donkey, but lab-grown meaning in heaven. So something falls down from heaven, it looks just like a donkey, and it tastes like a donkey, and it acts like a donkey, and so what about that? Would you say that's kosher, even though a donkey is not kosher? Amar le yarudna la ha amri le en davar tameh yored min hashamayim. Shamayim. And Abu answered, you foolish bird, that's not a good question. We already answered it, because it says a non-kosher item does not descend from heaven. If this descended from heaven, doesn't matter, even if it looks like a ham sandwich. If it came from heaven, then that means it is kosher. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.